In this short video, we're going to be covering the major themes that the book International Relations covers, and it establishes as well the basis for the scope of topics covered in the course. Before we venture into the various topics that are introduced in this book, it is a good idea to establish some basic definitions around the subject area of politics and political science, and also international relations and how that is situated within the discipline of political science. In essence, the definition of politics engages any type of collective decision making. On a much more simple level, we define politics as power, the ability to achieve something that would not otherwise be achieved. So in political science, this means that we are studying power, and we're attempting to do so systematically using the scientific method that is employed through pretty much every other discipline that you will study that has the word science attached to it. So essentially, we collect data, we analyze data, and we interpret it according to existing theories on the subject. So political science covers a range of human behaviors that surround issues related to power. And international relations takes those same methods and looks at how power works on the international level, usually, at least traditionally, between states. And by states, incidentally, we mean countries, the way that common language refers to entities in the world stage. This is a form of social organization that is really referred to as the state system. Initially, the discipline of international relations concerns itself with violence. That has largely a lot to do with the fact that it emerges as a discipline at the end of World War I. This is also, however, tied up with the Great Depression from 1929 on. So there are economic considerations, but we largely concern ourselves with war and violence in the early period. And that's because really of the impact that the First World War had on the country of the United States and Great Britain, where this discipline emerged. So you saw 17 million people killed in fighting. And the failure of classical diplomacy, in essence, the alliances that had been set up under the old world order had fallen apart. And so there was an intellectual drive to understand the causes and the consequences of war, and maybe to even prevent war. And in its initial phases, international relations really was dominated by two major perspectives, realism and idealism. And the idealist really had a perspective that you could end war by spreading democracy, whereas realists adopted the stance that war is basically inevitable and a result of anarchy, the lack of government in the world system. So states would do better to learn to operate within what is real, in other words, instead of hoping to achieve some ideal outcome. One of the ways that we think about world politics is to look at different eras. And by eras, we mean really kind of important historical moments that bring with them certain preoccupations and certain concerns. So we consider ourselves right now in the post 9/11 period, which means that we have begun to look at terrorism, failed states, some of the questions that were associated with Iraq and Afghanistan that create security issues that are not necessarily by the states themselves. So actors other than states become important in the post 9/11 era. The post-Cold War era is also where we are, and the Cold War was a very relevant period because the world was divided into bipolar powers, the United States and the USSR, and there was also a strong economic component to that because there were two different economic systems functioning, capitalism and communism, and those are ideologies wrapped in there as well. So we also look at this period as one of increased globalization, increased internationalization, more interaction between states, more interaction between people within states. And this means also that we have a growing need to understand the security issues associated with technology and with increased travel and with increased financial transactions between states. In a very general sense, we refer to this period as the modern period, or perhaps, depending on who you ask, the postmodern period. The modern period is the one that we associate with the growth of the state system and the international environment. We also associate it with the Protestant Reformation, which opposed a lot of challenges to the old traditions and the traditional authorities, and also with the Industrial Revolution. And because of this, there were a lot of sociological, economic, and political changes that came about. And this really characterizes not just politics, but the way that we study politics. And postmodernism is really seen as kind of the logical conclusion of modernism, where the last of the traditional authority structures are challenged and a new world order develops out of politics that are concerned with things like human rights and quality of life and emotional well-being, instead of some of the tangible questions, the economic and scarcity questions from the modern period. So this is debatable within the literature, but in general, we consider this either an extension of the modern period or an extension or a creation, the advent of the postmodern period. As we've moved through these periods in history, the areas of study, the domain of study in international relations has changed. So in the World War I and World War II period, the largest preoccupation, the largest areas of study related to political violence, specifically large-scale war between states. From the 1950s through the 1970s, aligning with the Cold War era, the questions and the concerns related to weaponry, nuclear weapons being proliferated by countries. This also brought up a significant area for policy analysis, for foreign policy of other countries, as we looked at the ways that the question of nuclear proliferation was negotiated between states. For example, the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. During this time, there is a growing connectedness between states in terms of liberal trade, there, especially among capitalist countries, because they're hoping to shore up their allies in this bipolar era. So creating more trade and more wealth between countries is the goal. So liberal trade is also an important area of study that begins in the Cold War period. The important thing to remember about this period is that states are seen as the prime actors. They are the ones that do the acting, that commit acts in the international environment. So they are the ones that make things happen. However, from the 1990s until now, you really see the discipline embracing a lot of different viewpoints that were not included in the beginning. So looking at the role of environmental politics, the role of feminist politics, and identity politics in general, and how that impacts international relations has become more of a common thing. And this era is especially marked because moving from a period, the previous period where states are the only actors that matter, we now identify a lot of different actors that matter: CEOs of multinational corporations, non-state combatants, terrorists or insurrectionaries. There are activists, non-governmental organizations. So there are a ton of people that try to influence international politics, and they have now been incorporated into our studies. So beginning on page 4 of the Lawson text, there is a discussion of how we conceptualize the term international, and it's not as straightforward as we would hope that it could be. But essentially, we are generally looking at a social science that incorporates history, law, philosophy, and looking at how states interact with each other. That is the basic definition, although we've already identified to this point that there are many more actors that are not states that are making a difference in world politics. So this is what leads to a little bit difficulty when we try to define this. In terms of the areas of study, the modern period, the current period, I should say, also has us looking at the role that culture and identity play in international relations. Not just the domestic level identities as far as splits between countries, between ethnicities or linguistic groups, which is a very common problem, especially among post-colonial countries. We also have scholars like Huntington who view identity and culture as encapsulating entire states, and looks at the ways that in the international environment different cultures are clashing with one another. Huntington is often criticized for being stereotypical and a bit bigoted in the way that he depicts, for example, the Muslim world. But he envisions a split between sort of the Western world, the United States, Western Europe, and the Asian, Confucian, and Islamic world. And he says that the international relations of the future will be characterized by clashes between which of these dominates the world scene. And this last bullet point refers to a continuing discussion about defining international terms that takes place on page 9 in your book. Essentially, it identifies the fact that there is an epistemological debate or a pedagogical debate within IR about what we should be studying and including. International politics is itself a pretty vague term, but you also have international studies. So international politics, of course, would deal with collective decision making and exchanges of power, whereas international studies, another viable area of inquiry, it actually is going to look into culture and food and architecture and art and a lot of different disciplines related around the international environment. So it's just more broad. But again, there are always reasons that we kind of include portions of international studies when we talk about international politics. So the major players are states, but we've identified that other actors matter as well. But the reason why the state system is so important is because it really represents two kind of countervailing forces. On the one hand, the former colonies of the Western European countries are creating multiple states in the system, and these are often fragile states because of the challenges they faced as post-colonial countries. But at the same time, Western Europe now is engaging in what we would call a regionalization. So at the same time as multiple states are being proliferated, we're also seeing them group up into larger organizations in the attempt to create, bigger international organizations. And so these international organizations are also major players in addition to states, due to globalization and internationalization. And internationalization essentially is the result of the process of decolonization. And a final note on the categorization or classification of these former colony states. They are sometimes referred to as the Global South, and formally referred to as the Third World. This really represents when they engaged in industrialization, so they were the third part of the world to begin that endeavor. So as states have become more connected through goods, people, and services across borders, the importance of global governance, or at least some type of institution to manage complexity, has become important. But this can be difficult if a state perceives a threat to its ability to rule itself.